Behind every great man is an even greater woman. It's a familiar phrase, perhaps even overused, but never has it rung truer than in the story of Clementine Churchill. Though her beauty once dazzled high society, Winston himself insisted it was the least thing about her. Brilliant, strong-willed, and unflinchingly brave, Clementine was the only person who could temper his legendary rages, his equal in intellect, his rival in will, and the only woman who could truly tame the lion. Yet behind her composed, commanding presence was a woman carrying the invisible wounds of a fractured childhood and a lifetime lived in the shadow of greatness. At times, Clementine questioned whether a life with a more ordinary man might have spared her the emotional toll of life beside a meteor. But in the end, she never faltered. She rose to every challenge, proving herself not just Winston's wife, but his most trusted confidant, closest ally, and the silent force behind Britain's wartime leader. Join us as we explore the extraordinary story of Clementine Churchill, the original Iron Lady, who stood not behind, but beside one of history's most towering figures, sacrificing her own autonomy and setting aside personal desires to uphold his relentless pursuit of greatness. If you're like me, you've probably received daily calls, voicemails, and texts from scammers, and your inbox is overflowing with spam emails. If you've ever wondered how they got your contact information in the first place, the answer is usually data brokers. Without our consent, these companies make billions of dollars a year selling our personal information, including our names, phone numbers, emails, and even home addresses to marketers, scammers, and even stalkers. And because this kind of thing isn't illegal in the US, the government does nothing to stop it, leaving millions of people vulnerable and unprotected. That's exactly why I recommend today's sponsor, Aura. Aura does all the hard work for you, automatically removing your personal information from these shady, predatory sites and keeping it off of them. But Aura also alerts you if your personal information is found on the dark web, sends real-time fraud alerts for your credit and banking activity, provides 24/7 monitoring to help keep your identity secure, and includes a secure VPN, antivirus software, and a password manager. Aura also offers round-the-clock US-based support if anything ever goes wrong, and they have US fraud experts ready to help you 24/7. And just in case the worst happens, Aura includes up to $5 million in identity theft insurance protection. So stop leaving yourself vulnerable to these predatory data brokers and scammers. Try Aura free for 14 days using my link, aura.com/stories through time, and see for yourself exactly how and where your data is being exposed and sold. Despite her grand destiny as the wife of one of the most legendary figures of the 20th century, Clementine Hosier's childhood was defined by instability and emotional neglect. Born in 1885 to Colonel Henry Hosier and Lady Blanche Hosier, she inherited noble blood but no fortune. Her parents' marriage, forged in 1878, was cold and adulterous. While Henry was knighted for his work with Lloyd's of London, he was frequently absent and had multiple affairs. Blanche followed suit with numerous public liaisons. None of their 4 children, Kitty, Clementine, and twins Nellie and Bill, were believed to be Henry's, with rumored fathers ranging from Bertie Mitford, grandfather of the famed Mitford sisters, to Bay Middleton. Blanche's scandalous behavior led to social ostracism. In 1891, Henry filed for divorce and took custody of Kitty and Clementine, despite little interest in parenting. They were first sent to a harsh Aunt Mary, then to a kind governess, Rose Stevenson, who was dismissed for being too soft. The girls were moved to a rigid Edinburgh school before Henry allowed Blanche to reclaim them. The reunion in Bayswater was strained, and Henry vanished soon after, cutting Blanche off financially and leaving the family impoverished. Blanche spent the next 8 years moving frequently to avoid creditors, clinging to appearances while accruing debt. She supported herself by writing food columns but often failed to feed her own children. Summers at Airlie Castle brought discipline and religious austerity under the Dowager Countess, while Blanche quietly encouraged athleticism in her children. Kitty became confident, but Clementine grew anxious and dependent on her. A bond with family friend Mary Paget provided emotional stability until Blanche, jealous, severed it when Clementine admitted she preferred Mary's care. By 1899, under rising stress, Blanche fled with Kitty and Clementine to Dieppe. Clementine thrived at a convent school, excelling especially in athletics, while Blanche embraced a bohemian lifestyle, gambling and socializing with figures like Oscar Wilde. Clementine, appalled, developed a lifelong aversion to gambling. When Henry suddenly reappeared and invited his daughters to dinner, Clementine's visit ended with a disturbing attempt to abduct her. Soon after, Kitty died of typhoid just shy of 17. Clementine was devastated, unable to connect with Nellie and Bill, while Blanche shifted focus to them. The family returned to England within a year, and Clementine finally found steadiness at Berkhamsted School. She flourished under the guidance of Mademoiselle Croon and other inspirational teachers. During this time, Henry requested a final meeting. Clementine, accompanied by Blanche, endured an excruciating public argument between her estranged parents, the last time she saw her father. He died in 1907, just a year before her marriage. Though frightened by him in life, she later regretted that he never met Winston. At Berkhamsted, Clementine distinguished herself, particularly in French, earning a silver medal from the French ambassador. Influenced by her suffragist headmistress, she secretly studied mathematics in a graveyard, hoping to attend university. But Blanche shut down these ambitions, fearing Clementine would become a dreaded bluestocking. Instead, she placed her under the patronage of Lady St. Helier to prepare her for society and marriage. By 1903, Clementine's academic dreams were gone. She refined her manners in Paris and Berlin before debuting in London, where her beauty turned heads. Nellie tallied her many proposals. One suitor, Sidney Cornwallis Peel, was serious, but she found him dull and ended the engagement. In desperation to escape her bleak home life, she accepted a proposal from Lionel Earl, an older, wealthy man. A trip to the Netherlands revealed his arrogance and triggered a breakdown, leaving her bedridden for 2 months. Clementine began teaching French and sewing for her cousin's fashion business to support herself. Though admired for her looks, she was mocked by richer relatives as the hosier. Life under Blanche's roof remained strict. Clementine was once slapped for arriving home late, and she again sought refuge with Mary Paget. She first encountered Winston Churchill in 1904 at a ball hosted by Lord and Lady Crewe. The ambitious young politician noticed the shy, fawn-like girl, but unusually tongue-tied, failed to ask her to dance. Clementine, unimpressed, left with someone else. At the time, Churchill was known as a confirmed bachelor, deeply absorbed in politics. Everything changed in March 1908 at a dinner party thrown by Lady St. Helier. Wearing plain white satin and missing gloves, Clementine arrived with low expectations. Churchill, similarly disinterested beforehand, was captivated by her intellect and spoke only to her throughout the evening. Clementine wasn't physically drawn to him, but she found his mind stimulating and later described him as very interesting. Churchill pursued her swiftly, inviting her to his mother's estate where she witnessed his cabinet promotion. While she traveled abroad, he kept in touch through letters filled with ideas and philosophy rather than affection. Clementine praised his brilliance in letters to her mother. During Churchill's re-election campaign, when he mentioned another woman, Lady Dorothy Howard, Clementine's jealousy revealed deeper feelings. Sensing her affection, Winston encouraged her interest in politics and wrote vulnerably, "I am a solitary creature in the midst of crowds." In August 1908, Winston invited Clementine to Blenheim Palace. Though nervous, she accepted and sensed the formality of the visit, greeted by Winston, his mother, and the Duke of Marlborough. At dinner, she remained quiet while Winston held court. The next morning, taking shelter in a Greek temple from the rain, she gave herself a private ultimatum. If Winston didn't propose before a spider crossed a crack in the floor, she'd leave. He proposed just in time. Clementine agreed, on the condition that it stay secret until her mother approved. Winston immediately blurted out the news and handed Lady Blanche a letter before boarding the train with Clementine. Blanche approved, admiring Churchill's drive and noting, "I do not know which of the two is the more in love." London society was split. Some feared Winston would overpower Clementine, others thought she was too headstrong. Former Prime Minister Lord Rosebery predicted a 6-month marriage. Churchill soon stirred trouble by visiting Violet Asquith, daughter of the Prime Minister who had long loved him. Violet lashed out, calling Clementine stupid as an owl. After an emotional breakdown and facial injury from a fall, she and her family boycotted the wedding. The wedding took place on September 12th, 1908, at St. Margaret's, Westminster. The guest list of 1,300 included political elites and Blanche's former lovers, including Bertie Mitford, rumored to be Clementine's real father. Blanche wore purple silk. Jenny Churchill wore beaver-colored satin. Winston's suit was ridiculed in the press. At the altar, he greeted Clementine with a handshake. They spent their wedding night at Blenheim, alone in the vast palace. Likely both virgins, Winston had even sought advice from his mother. The Italian honeymoon was intimate and joyful. Winston wrote they had loitered and loved, calling sex a serious and delightful occupation. Clementine became pregnant within a month. Her pregnancy made Winston's frilly, overly feminine bachelor flat unbearable, decorated by Jenny, who remained over-involved. Though she welcomed Clementine, Jenny's extravagance and selfishness grated, especially given how she'd neglected Winston as a child. His emotional wounds ran deep. Ignored by both parents, he'd written Jenny desperate letters as a boy. Only his nanny, Mrs. Everest, had truly cared for him. These parallel traumas, neglectful parents, public shame, and uncertain paternity, bonded Clementine and Winston. He feared repeating his father's tragic decline, and though bold in public, masked insecurity in private. Clementine internalized pain. Both felt like outsiders seeking belonging in each other. Marriage gave Winston the emotional anchor he lacked. He struggled with intimacy, using pet names like Puss Cat while he was her sweet amber dog. But their upbringings clashed. Winston had known wealth and privilege, Clementine poverty and hardship. He had never bathed himself or taken a bus. She worried constantly about finances. They moved to 33 Eccleston Square in 1909. Clementine decorated modestly, aside from a fruit tree mural mocked by Sir Edward Grey. She insisted on separate bedrooms, granting Winston entry by invitation only. Jenny continued to interfere, even choosing their front door color. On July 11, 1909, Clementine gave birth to Diana at home. Winston was present but soon returned to politics and resumed writing to Violet Asquith. Feeling neglected, Clementine left Diana with a wet nurse and escaped to Brighton with her sister for 10 days. Winston, ever career-focused, pressured Clementine to recover, not for her health, but to support his campaign. He believed in staying true to one's nature, writing, unless you happen to have a very tiresome self. Clementine knew retreating wouldn't work. She chose to engage in his world, embracing liberal politics and rejecting Lord Rosebery's conservatism. By her return to London, she was no longer a passive wife, but a political partner in the making. Though brilliant, Clementine mourned her lack of higher education. Winston, self-taught from his army years, took it upon himself to educate her, assigning readings and discussing politics. She resented the force-feeding, but remained determined to keep pace. From Sussex, she wrote of feeling imprisoned, craving a political life, an ambition Winston respected. Jealousy often surfaced. Clementine teased Winston about his cats, the women in his orbit, but demanded honesty. After one argument, he promised, "I do not love and will never love any woman in the world but you." His temper rarely turned on her, but it wore her down. Clementine had a quick temper herself, often over trivial things, but Winston, hardened by Jenny's volatility, remained patient. They made a pact never to sleep angry, often quoting, "Let not the sun go down upon your wrath." Finances were their greatest strain. Winston's modest salary didn't curb his lavish habits, once splurging on pale pink silk underwear. Clementine ran a small household staff but watched their debts rise. Winston, like Blanche, gambled and ignored bills. His money-saving ideas bordered on ridiculous, suggesting they cut the phone line to save £3. In quiet despair, Clementine sold a diamond necklace. Winston tried and failed to buy it back. Still, love endured. At Winston's 35th birthday, he wore a paper crown and held Clementine's hand all night. One guest declared them the most in-love couple they'd ever seen. Yet Clementine still enjoyed male attention, once flirting with notorious libertine Wilfred Scawen Blunt, who called her the most beautiful of women. Winston rarely praised her appearance, seeking warmth over passion. Clementine and Winston's greatest ideological rift was over women's suffrage. She supported it, he did not. In 1909, a suffragette attacked him with a dog whip at Bristol Station, nearly pushing him onto the tracks. Clementine leapt over luggage and pulled him to safety. Though still conservative on the issue, Winston began respecting her stance. When he championed the people's budget to tax the wealthy for welfare, aristocrats turned on him. His own cousin Sonny even crossed the street to avoid him. Clementine, proud of his popularity among workers, dismissed the elite as ignorant, vulgar, and prejudiced. By her late 20s, Clementine's beauty was legendary, earning her the nickname the reincarnation of Venus. But unlike Jenny Churchill, she refused to use it for social leverage. When Alice Keppel suggested taking a wealthy lover to boost Winston's prospects, Clementine refused, prompting Keppel to call her positively selfish. In 1910, Winston became Home Secretary at 35. Clementine supported him through bouts of depression, known as his Black Dog moods. A second election led to the 1911 Parliament Act, shifting power to the Commons. Winston retreated to Alderley to recover, while Clementine, too pregnant to travel, stayed behind and endured a difficult, delayed labor. In May 1911, she gave birth to Randolph, whom she breastfed. Winston proudly noted his healthy appetite, calling greediness at the table a virtue. After Winston's appointment as First Lord of the Admiralty in late 1911, Clementine took on a more public role, christening ships and hosting events under growing pressure. In February 1912, during Belfast riots, a mob nearly overturned their car. Though they escaped, the trauma likely caused a miscarriage the following month. Clementine later wrote to Winston of the grief and physical toll, and avoided pregnancy for over a year. Determined to speak up, Clementine published a satirical letter to the Times, mocking anti-suffragists by suggesting that if women were truly unbalanced, they should be purged. Even Prime Minister Asquith, a staunch opponent, praised her wit. Around this time, Winston's new Admiralty post came with Admiralty House, though Clementine preferred the more relaxed Admiralty Yacht Enchantress. Despite their growing influence, Violet Asquith remained a shadow over Clementine's peace. In 1912, still recovering, she overheard Winston laughing with Violet in Genoa, deepening her emotional strain. Even Violet admitted Winston floundered without Clementine. Now fully stepping into political life, Clementine edited speeches, hosted gatherings, and arranged high-level meetings, including one with Lord Kitchener. Lloyd George told Winston she was his salvation. Winston replied, her beauty was the least thing about her. By 1912, Clementine juggled motherhood and politics. She spent summers in Kent with the children, writing funny updates about Randolph's tantrums, but rarely mentioning Diana, hinting at emotional distance. Admiralty House was draining their finances, just as she'd feared. In summer 1914, Clementine rented a cottage in Norfolk, enjoying rare calm with the children, but the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand shattered that peace. As war loomed, she wanted to return to London, but Winston refused, prioritizing naval defense. Even as the coast grew vulnerable, he insisted they stay, and a cinema marquee reassured locals that Mrs. Winston Churchill and her children are in residence. Publicly praised, Clementine felt abandoned, now competing not just with Violet and politics, but with war itself. Isolated, pregnant, and caring for anxious children and her frail mother, Clementine's mental state deteriorated. When Nellie left to aid the war effort in Belgium, Clementine broke down. She sent Winston desperate letters expressing fear, loneliness, and even confessed to self-harm. Eventually, he relented and allowed her to come home. Back in London, Clementine found purpose in the war. With her brother Bill at sea, Jack at the front, and Nellie captured by Germans, the conflict felt deeply personal. She threw herself into naval affairs, attending inspections and mastering strategy. Her sharp advice influenced Winston. She urged tact in dismissing Admiral Callahan and reminded him that officers' wives held political sway. But Winston's impulsiveness persisted. On October 2, 1914, the day Clementine was due, he rushed off to Antwerp in costume to boost Belgian morale and requested a military command. The offer was denied. Antwerp fell days later, staining his reputation. Alone, Clementine gave birth to Sarah on October 7th, torn between joy and fury. Clementine backed Winston's Dardanelles plan, but distrusted Admiral Fisher, whose instability she quickly noticed. Winston valued Fisher's brilliance. Clementine feared his paranoia. Her concerns proved valid when Fisher later accused Winston of favoritism and confronted Clementine with wild accusations of a mistress. She dismissed him, but deeply resented Winston's blind loyalty. As the Dardanelles campaign unraveled, hindered by poor planning and low supplies, Clementine stepped in, arranging medical aid for wounded troops in Malta. Even Asquith praised her efforts. Diana prayed, "God bless the Dardanelles," but early victories gave way to disaster. Meanwhile, gas attacks and shell shortages ravaged the Western Front, and Winston's political footing crumbled. When Fisher resigned in May 1915, the Dardanelles effort collapsed. Though blame was widespread, Winston was scapegoated, reviled by Tories, distrusted by Liberals, and shunned by the king. Nearly 50,000 Allied troops died at Gallipoli. Despite Clementine's warnings about Fisher, Kitchener, and Hamilton, she couldn't shield Winston from the fallout. Furious, Clementine wrote to Asquith defending Winston and accusing the cabinet of cowardice. Asquith dismissed her as a maniac, while his wife Margot called the Churchills shallow and insolent. Clementine, humiliated but unbroken, vowed she'd one day dance on Asquith's grave. Tensions erupted at a Downing Street dinner when Margot Asquith cruelly told Clementine she'd lost her looks since childbirth. When Clementine criticized Asquith's leadership, Margot snapped, calling her a fishwife. Clementine despised the Prime Minister's detachment, obsession with games, and his fixation on Venetia Stanley, to whom he leaked state secrets. When Venetia married someone else, many suspected Clementine's influence, further fueling the Asquith's animosity. Winston's dismissal from the Admiralty shattered him. Outwardly composed, he privately seethed. Demoted to Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, he was humiliated, likened by one aide to Beethoven losing his hearing. Blamed for Gallipoli, he faced more bitterness at home than abroad. Even Violet Asquith turned away. General Hastings Ismay later credited Clementine's unwavering love with saving Winston from collapse. The Churchills withdrew to Hoe Farm, where Goonie, their friend and the wife of Winston's younger brother Randolph, handed Winston a child's paint set. Captivated, he began painting obsessively. Clementine, seeing its effect, bought him proper supplies. Winston would later say painting had saved his life. Losing power meant losing everything: position, income, their home, and beloved perks like the Enchantress. Though Asquith offered to let them remain at Admiralty House, Clementine declined. Temporarily without a home, they stayed with Winston's aunt near the Ritz. By June 1915, Clementine and the children moved in with Jack and Goonie. With little to do and dignity wounded, Winston set his sights on returning to military service. Winston arrived in France in November 1915. Initially at headquarters, he soon moved to the trenches at Ploegsteert, enduring mud, shellfire, and rats. Though met with skepticism, he earned his men's respect through humor and resilience. As conditions worsened, even his upbeat letters to Clementine couldn't conceal the brutality. While Winston was away, Clementine quietly rebuilt his political prospects. She handled his constituency, worked press connections, and framed his service as a patriotic sacrifice. Now deeply dependent, Winston wrote to her daily, calling her his wise and sagacious military pussycat. She managed their tight finances carefully while tending to Diana's neuralgia and Randolph's mischief, including prank calls to the Foreign Office. Still, her life revolved around Winston. Clementine feared Winston's impulsive nature would backfire. When he considered petitioning Field Marshal French for a promotion, she warned him against it. Though worried she'd seem a harsh, arguing scold, she stood firm. Leadership, she reminded him, came from trust, not aggression. When he secretly ordered a general's uniform, she feigned support but canceled it. Fortunately, Asquith denied the promotion, averting embarrassment. Winston's temper remained sharp. He dismissed her advice but demanded constant letters. Exhausted, Clementine wrote, "You must not beat your poor cat so hard. I am absolutely worn out tonight." Winston softened, replying, "My greatest good fortune has been to find you." The day after he left for France, Clementine lunched with Lloyd George. He declared, "We must get Winston back." She distrusted him, believing he helped engineer Winston's downfall, calling him fair of speech, shifty of eye, treacherous of heart. Despite her anger, Clementine re-engaged the Asquiths. She softened Margot and had her first sincere conversation with the Prime Minister since Winston's ousting. Winston, eager for details, told Clementine it was a relief to write one's heart out to her. Outside politics, Clementine embraced wartime service. After Germany's first gas attacks, she led efforts to produce emergency masks. By mid-1916, she managed 9 canteens feeding hundreds of munitions workers daily. She commuted by tram and tube, riding Winston at dawn after long shifts. She urged Winston to be fair with his men. He responded with practical gestures like delousing and organizing games, but also made comical requests like assigning bodyguards, which amused his troops. The war expanded women's roles, offering aristocrats like Clementine new purpose. Winston, however, felt uneasy with her growing independence. As she juggled war work and caring for her ailing mother, he reminded her not to neglect his needs, writing, "I have no one but you to act for me." Nonetheless, she pressed on. Her political circle widened. She condemned F.E. Smith as dulled by luxury, branded McKenna noxious, and mocked Balfour as a shabby maiden aunt's tabby cat. Believing weak leadership was dragging out the war, she saw no clear end in sight. In February 1916, Lloyd George opened Clementine's largest canteen at Ponder's End. Despite strike threats, workers honored her with a gold brooch. She wrote Winston, "I nearly fainted with emotion." That year, Violet Asquith married Morris Bonham Carter. Though still bitter, Clementine took pride in Randolph's charming guests at the wedding. Their granddaughter, Helena, would go on to become a famous actress. By year's end, Winston toured the front lines, disillusioned by death and defeat. Clementine counseled him not to brood too much, reassuring him, as sure as day follows night, you will come into your own again. She urged caution, reminding him not to sabotage his path back. In early 1916, Winston urged Clementine to mend ties with old adversaries like Lord Fisher. A weekend with the Asquiths and a golf game with the Prime Minister signaled Winston's return could be possible, if handled delicately. She advised him to send a gracious letter, not reopen old wounds. On February 25, 1916, Clementine hosted Asquith for dinner, an elegant evening of bridge and light talk that left him in high good humor. But Winston undermined it by reigniting contact with Fisher. Furious, Clementine directly confronted Fisher and demanded he back off. Winston refused and, in Parliament, attacked Balfour while calling for Fisher's return. The speech backfired. Even his allies mocked him. He sought comfort from Violet, but only Clementine told him the truth. He had to return to the trenches. Winston came home in May 1916 to ridicule. The press branded him a megalomaniac politician. Even allies turned cold. In December, Lloyd George replaced Asquith but excluded Winston from the new cabinet, saying his name was more toxic than the Kaiser's. Winston, convinced his service had redeemed him, was crushed. A shift came in March 1917 when the Dardanelles Commission partially exonerated him. That July, with U.S. involvement and leadership stretched thin, Lloyd George appointed him Minister of Munitions. Clementine, relieved, never forgave Lloyd George for letting Winston suffer as others died. Winston now oversaw 2.5 million workers and 12,000 civil servants. His by-election in Dundee was no guarantee, but Clementine campaigned relentlessly, helping him win by over 5,000 votes. Despite the comeback, Winston's self-absorption remained. At a July 1918 banquet honoring FDR, he spoke only about himself. Roosevelt later dismissed him as a stinker. Meanwhile, Clementine felt overlooked. Pregnant again, she worried about Winston's dangerous flying habit. He'd built a private airstrip and survived multiple crashes, brushing off her concerns. Financial pressures mounted. Their new estate, Lullenden, was cold, unelectrified, and crumbling. Hired German prisoners of war were dismissed after a poisoning scare. Crops failed, and Winston poured money into livestock and landscaping, ignoring their debts. Feeling abandoned, Clementine stopped writing. Winston, feeling neglected, responded with mock outrage, signing his letter as her vilely neglected pig. Motherhood drained her. Randolph was unruly, and Margot Asquith claimed Clementine had little or no maternal feeling. She feared losing her place in Winston's life as his career surged, yet she pushed herself to the brink, managing war canteens, attending factory inspections in evening gowns. In late 1918, she was awarded a CBE. Their money woes continued. They sublet their London home to the Labour Party and floated between friends' houses. Often alone, Clementine, heavily pregnant, confided to Lady Jean Hamilton that she couldn't afford proper care or even housing, half joking that she'd give her one of the twins if she had to. Lady Jean offered her home. This moved Winston to act. His Aunt Cornelia loaned them a house for the birth, granting Clementine some peace. She urged Winston to rebrand himself, not as a warrior, but a builder, transforming Britain's wartime workforce into agents of post-war reconstruction, particularly for housing reform. She envisioned garden cities. Though Winston acknowledged shifting gender roles, he resisted their implications. When Nancy Astor entered Parliament, he quipped it was like someone bursting in on his bath. Still, women with property, like Clementine, gained the vote. Fashion evolved, too, favoring athletic, androgynous styles that suited her form and spirit. As victory neared in late 1918, Clementine looked to the future. War had strained their marriage, finances, and public standing, but Winston had clawed his way back. On Armistice Day, November 11th, she joined him at his office. As Big Ben struck 11, they watched London erupt in celebration, then rode through the cheering crowds together. 4 days later, Clementine gave birth to their red-haired daughter, Marigold, nicknamed Duckadilly. The labor was hard, but she recovered quickly. Just 10 days later, Parliament dissolved, and Winston held his seat despite criticism of harsh reparations. In January 1919, he became Secretary of State for War and Air, charged with demobilization. Winston's focus shifted to Russia, determined to crush Bolshevism. He poured resources into the White Army and coined the brutal phrase, "Kiss the Hun and kill the Bolshi." But the British public, exhausted by war, resisted. Protests erupted outside their home demanding his arrest. In 1921, he was pushed out of the War Office and reassigned to the Colonial Office. Making matters worse, Cousin Claire Sheridan's affair with Trotsky undermined Clementine's campaign to recast Winston as a man of peace. Financial insecurity lingered. Lullingdon was unmanageable, and a failed house deal left them temporarily adrift. Salvation came when Sir Ernest Cassell arranged for them to purchase 2 Sussex Square. Even then, Winston dreamed of a grand estate, while Clementine, ever practical, focused on survival. At last, financial stability arrived when Winston inherited Garin Tower and a dependable income. While he celebrated by buying a Rolls-Royce, Clementine quietly used the windfall to help her family, supporting her sister Nellie's hat shop and easing her mother Blanche's debts. In spring 1921, Clementine joined Winston on a political tour to Cairo, her first official trip abroad. She charmed diplomats and bonded with T.E. Lawrence. Despite the luxury, the trip had risks. Their train was attacked by nationalists, but Clementine remained composed and left a strong impression. Back in England, life finally felt secure. They had steady income, a permanent home, and Winston's star was rising. But that stability shattered when Clementine's brother Bill was found dead in a Paris hotel, likely by suicide after years of gambling. She insisted on a dignified funeral and convinced Winston to attend. Bill's parting gift, a gold-topped cane, remained with Winston for life. Just 2 months later, Jenny Churchill died from a fall. Despite past tensions, Clementine had grown fond of her and mourned her deeply. Winston, devastated, likened her death to an amputation. To grieve Marigold's illness, Clementine sent the children to Broadstairs and briefly visited Eaton Hall, leaving the recovering toddler behind. But Marigold's condition rapidly deteriorated, and by their return, she had septicemia. On August 22nd, Marigold asked her mother to sing her favorite song, "I'm Forever Blowing Bubbles." As Clementine sang, the child reached out her hand and whispered, "Not tonight. Finish it tomorrow." The next day, just shy of her 3rd birthday, Marigold died with both parents by her side. Winston, devastated, buried her quietly at Kensal Green. Clementine kept her photo on her dressing table for life. Clementine forced herself forward. A trip to Scotland brought no peace, and Winston soon returned to politics, leaving her alone in London. A graveside visit with the children left her racked with guilt. In Cannes, she discovered she was pregnant again, perhaps subconsciously trying to fill the void. She remained active, even winning a tennis tournament, but home life was strained. Randolph was difficult, Diana anxious, Sarah still frail. As colonial secretary, Winston was consumed by the Irish crisis. Clementine, sympathetic to Irish self-rule, advocated diplomacy. Her views helped shape the 1922 treaty granting Irish independence. But the danger lingered. After Sir Henry Wilson's assassination, Winston learned he was next. He armed himself and slept in the attic while leaving Clementine, heavily pregnant, unguarded. On September 15, 1922, Clementine gave birth to Mary. Days later, Winston, without consulting her, bought Chartwell, misleading the children into thinking they had chosen it. The house was damp, dark, and poorly renovated. He spent £5,000 without her approval. Clementine, appalled by another costly estate after Lowlondon, was furious. Though dismayed, she adapted, planting a rose garden while Winston added lakes and competed with Lloyd George over orchard yields. He even built her a new bedroom and drawing room, perhaps as penance. Chartwell became their home for 40 years, but to Clementine it always felt like a burden. Winston's political downfall came fast. Just before the 1922 election, he had an emergency appendectomy. Weeks postpartum, Clementine campaigned in Dundee with baby Mary, facing jeers, IRA banners, and spit. Though loyal, she feared his rhetoric was too aggressive. He lost in a humiliating fourth-place finish. The election upended British politics. Labour surged, Liberals split, and Winston was left without a seat, a party, or even an appendix. They moved to France, renting a villa in Cannes, where Clementine played tennis and Winston wrote The World Crisis, earning £20,000. Her 38th birthday was celebrated in grand style, but they were rarely alone, surrounded by staff and secretaries. Back in England by May 1923, they found Chartwell still under construction and had to rent elsewhere. Renovation costs tripled to £15,000. While Winston enjoyed life on the Duke of Westminster's yacht, Clementine grew increasingly resentful, especially after losing their London home at Sussex Square. When they finally moved into Chartwell, Clementine wasn't there. She had fled to Dieppe to see her mother, an uncharacteristic retreat. Usually the planner, she became the one escaping. Winston, sensing her absence, sent poetic letters, admitting he felt frightened without her. She returned, but the resentment lingered. Despite Winston's additions, a tennis court, croquet lawn, and pool, she saw Chartwell as a financial trap. His playful projects, tree houses, lakes, clashed with her frugal instincts. While Clementine vacationed with the children, Winston indulged whims. She kept the estate running, enforcing diets, arranging flowers, maintaining order while managing a household of 20 overwhelmed staff. Winston's eccentricities became routine. He insisted on timed baths, performed somersaults that flooded lower floors, and ran naked through the halls. Clementine, though also uninhibited, upheld strict standards, installing drains, ensuring the house gleamed, and keeping the chaos contained. By 1926, their monthly expenses hit £477, over £25,000 today. Winston offered cost-saving suggestions, like renting Chartwell or giving up cigars, but never followed through. Clementine humored him, knowing he'd dropped the idea. His attempt to run a working farm while refusing to butcher livestock infuriated her. She wrote a 7-page letter criticizing the waste. Still, she underestimated his earning power. Painting, once a hobby, became lucrative, especially alongside his writing, which he later published as Painting as a Pastime. Winston's 1924 return to politics as Chancellor of the Exchequer unsettled Clementine. Though loyal, she distrusted the Conservatives who had once betrayed him. Even Violet Asquith called Clementine a natural radical. The Churchills had few true friends, relying on family and political allies. Her sister Nellie visited often, though her bohemian nature clashed with Clementine's order. Their nephew Esmond, who later fought in the Spanish Civil War, openly challenged Winston's views. As Chancellor, Winston pursued contentious policies. The 1925 return to the gold standard deepened unemployment, and during the 1926 general strike, Clementine worked behind the scenes, hosting dinners to ease tensions. Though Winston spoke well on poverty, his actions often favored the elite. Chartwell became a bustling hub, more hotel than home. Clementine orchestrated it all while Winston lingered in the bath, making guests wait. Visitors ranged from Anthony Eden to Charlie Chaplin and Albert Einstein. Still, Winston's constant pursuits left her to carry the household. She read history to better engage in his world, but had no real hobbies or social life of her own. Often isolated, she found solace in her devoted aide, Grace Hamblin. By the late 1920s, Clementine recognized she needed space to preserve her sanity. She took spa retreats across Europe, citing health, though emotional exhaustion was the real cause. Life at home revolved around Winston. Mary later recalled, "Father always came first, second, and third." Clementine was affectionate but strict and emotionally distant, while Winston was indulgent yet largely absent. The children, mostly raised by nannies, felt pressure to please her. Christmas was her exception. She created a magical experience, perhaps compensating for her usual emotional reserve. Her relationship with Diana remained strained. Diana, overshadowed by Winston's favorite, Randolph, suffered from deep insecurity. Sarah, independent and spirited, didn't fit the family's political mold. Randolph, spoiled and arrogant, was punished at Eton for his behavior, yet Winston encouraged his ego by letting him spar with ministers. Though aware of his flaws, Winston rarely intervened. Clementine's icy upbringing left its mark. Her mother, Lady Blanche, grew increasingly cruel and alcoholic. In 1925, Clementine returned reluctantly to Dieppe as Blanche lay dying. Winston sent a poetic tribute. Clementine balanced funeral logistics with holiday plans. Shortly after, she was hit by a bus, injured but not seriously. Ordered to rest in Venice, she begged Winston to join her. He refused, prioritizing work, an emotional blow. In 1929, Winston's political standing faltered. In the flapper election, the first with full women's suffrage, he barely kept his seat. His unpopular stance on the general strike and gold standard left him looking elitist. Labor's Ramsay MacDonald took office, and Winston entered his wilderness years. Losing their official residence, the Churchills moved between rentals before settling at 11 Morpeth Mansions. Clementine made the flat cozy, despite its bittersweet view of Parliament. Then came the 1929 Wall Street crash. Unbeknownst to Clementine, Winston had gambled £10,000 in U.S. stocks and lost everything. He confessed after their return home. They shuttered Chartwell for the winter, sent Mary to live in a butler's cottage, and canceled all family holidays. In 1931, Winston left for a U.S. lecture tour to ease their finances, but was hit by a taxi in New York. Clementine rushed to him, but their money troubles deepened. Winston sold an article about the accident to cover medical bills. Public sympathy surged. 140 admirers, including Charlie Chaplin and the Prince of Wales, pooled money to buy him a Daimler. But debts loomed. Clementine's health collapsed. A tonsil infection turned to blood poisoning, then mastoid disease, requiring 2 surgeries. Though typically detached, Winston read psalms at her bedside. Still, he dismissed her nervous exhaustion while nurturing his own gloom. Clementine summed up her fatigue in a bitter poem. Here lies a woman who always was tired, for she lived in a world where too much was required. In 1932, Winston returned from Bavaria shaken by Nazi militarism. Dismissed as paranoid, he warned of the threat while politically sidelined. He leaned on his secretaries for comfort. Clementine, no longer jealous, even invited Ethel Barrymore to cheer him up. Randolph had become unbearable, spoiled, arrogant, and scandal-prone by 21. Even Winston began distancing himself. Clementine barred him from Chartwell and told staff never to leave her alone with him. Their daughter struggled too. Diana's 1927 debut was eclipsed by cousin Diana Mitford, worsening her insecurity. She married John Bailey in 1932, but his alcoholism doomed the marriage. Sarah, bold and defiant, hated high society and longed to act, dreams her parents disapproved of. When Sarah fell for older Austrian comedian Vic Oliver, Clementine fled on a long ski trip. Winston handled it poorly, insulting Oliver and threatening scandal. Clementine later offered Sarah an apartment and full freedom if she ended it. Sarah refused, calling the offer insulting. In 1936, she eloped to New York and married Oliver on Christmas Eve. Clementine found out from a newspaper. Winston was livid, sent Randolph to intervene, and hired detectives. But Sarah went through with it. Winston faced repeated setbacks. His fierce opposition to Indian self-rule isolated him politically. Clementine agreed with his imperial views, but the 1935 Government of India Act passed regardless. During the 1936 abdication crisis, Winston backed Edward VIII. His loyalty backfired. His emotion-filled speech in the House of Commons was mocked as a dog being sick on the carpet. Rumors spread that he was mad or syphilitic. Only after the abdication did he admit he'd misjudged. With Sarah's rebellion, mounting financial strain, and Winston's political disgrace, Clementine privately told her friend Goonie she considered divorce. Goonie advised a retreat. Clementine left for Austria. Her departure shocked Winston, who sent small gestures of remorse, including a cold note on Sarah, whose impulsive marriage was already on the brink of collapse. She has done what she liked, and now has to like what she has done. By the end of the decade, all their children were mired in personal chaos, affairs, drinking, failed marriages. Clementine returned, calmer but exhausted, and chose to stay, though at great emotional cost. By 1935, Winston was still out of office. Clementine saw a strategic advantage in his isolation. It distanced him from failed policies and positioned him as a comeback figure. As Hitler reoccupied the Rhineland and Spain descended into civil war, Chartwell turned into a haven for dissidents, foreign journalists, and critics of appeasement. Clementine stayed engaged, monitoring his speeches and political moves from behind the scenes. By 1937, Neville Chamberlain had fully excluded Winston. The rift between appeasers and critics turned personal. Britain's elite embraced Nazi culture. Aristocrats sent daughters to Berlin, women wore swastika jewelry, and Cliveden salons praised Hitler. Even Clementine's niece, Diana Mitford, married Oswald Mosley at Goebbels' home with Hitler present. Though Winston was ridiculed as hysterical, Clementine stood by him, knowing history would vindicate him. After Hitler annexed Austria in 1938, Winston predicted Czechoslovakia would fall next. The Munich Agreement proved him right, but Chamberlain returned to applause. The Churchills were ostracized. Even conservatives tried to unseat Winston. Chartwell became a lonely holdout of resistance. Clementine fought back. She condemned appeasers, once reducing an admiral's wife to tears. Drained by politics, she took a Caribbean cruise. Winston, feeling abandoned, wrote anxious letters. But the trip radicalized her. Horrified by poverty in the British West Indies, she returned more politically driven. When Chamberlain suppressed a report on colonial neglect, her outrage deepened. Her timing was prescient. 6 weeks after her return, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. Public opinion swung to Winston. Clementine joined the fight, campaigning, speaking out, and condemning both Hitler and Chamberlain. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Clementine watched from the gallery as Britain declared war. On September 3rd, the Churchills stood on their terrace, watching blimps rise over London. That night, Chamberlain appointed Winston First Lord of the Admiralty. He moved quickly, boosting radar, reinforcing the Navy, and waging an aggressive anti-submarine campaign. The early naval war was grim. His Majesty's Royal Oak was sunk, and mines wreaked havoc. But in December, the scuttling of the Admiral Graf Spee lifted morale. In the U.S., Roosevelt began corresponding with Winston. Clementine helped mend tensions. Understanding American support would be vital. With Winston's Admiralty salary and the sale of Morpeth mansions, their financial troubles eased. Clementine embraced the war effort, raising funds for minesweepers, supporting hospitals, and insisting their children stay in Britain to show unity. Each child contributed. Mary joined the Red Cross, Sarah the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, Diana became an air raid warden, Randolph married Pamela Digby, whom Clementine distrusted. Her instincts were right. Randolph's drinking and cruelty soon collapsed the marriage, drawing Clementine and Pamela into a surprising alliance. In April 1940, Germany invaded Norway. Fears spread that Winston would again be blamed, as with Gallipoli, but this time he emerged stronger. On May 10th, with Germany invading Western Europe, Chamberlain resigned. Halifax declined the premiership. Winston was summoned to Buckingham Palace. Before going, he stopped at Admiralty House. Clementine was waiting. At 65, Winston became Prime Minister. Clementine now stood at his side during Britain's darkest hour. She helped refine his speeches, guided his messaging, and ensured he spoke with clarity and resolve. Yet she fumed that appeasers still filled his cabinet and feared their influence. As France fell and Britain stood alone, Winston assumed dual roles, Prime Minister and Minister of Defense. Clementine, disturbed by his volatility, quietly worked to ensure alternate voices were heard. In June 1940, she wrote him a candid letter urging restraint. He listened. Staff noted a visible softening, thanks to her influence. Though resented by officials, Clementine championed women's wartime roles early. By 1941, 2 million women had joined the workforce, many inspired by her advocacy. She volunteered as a fire watcher and rallied older women to help rebuild bombed cities. She took special pride in Mary, who commanded men in an anti-aircraft unit. On September 15, 1940, Battle of Britain Day, Clementine stood beside Winston in the fighter command bunker. When told only one plane remained, they braced for disaster. Victory came, but the Blitz followed. While Winston led militarily, Clementine tackled civilian needs, overhauling shelters, hospitals, and morale. She became his moral compass, personally reading letters from civilians and pushing the government to act. One from Bethnal Green led her to reform shelter conditions, insisting on beds, heat, and sanitation. She toured shelters with ministers and even convinced her rival, Lord Beaverbrook, to deliver 2 million beds. Her efforts kept Winston ahead of public anger. Privately, she safeguarded his health. She filtered visitors, protected his rest, and made hard decisions, including refusing to intervene when her fascist niece, Diana Moseley, was imprisoned, despite Winston later authorizing her release. In late 1940, Picture Post criticized Clementine as obscure and unremarkable. Hurt, she told Cecil Beaton she feared she wasn't good enough. Still, she led by action, calm during raids, once sipping tea in the garden as bombs fell. When Number 10 was bombed, she made their move to the annex feel like home. Winston's habit of visiting bombing sites unnerved her, so she joined him, ensuring he returned quickly. Civilians rallied around her, waving flags amid rubble. To keep Winston safe, she created a quiet surveillance system. Staff alerted her to his movement so she could intercept. She hid his boots, delayed departures, and padded his cars with blankets. Security at home was airtight. Even cabinet ministers were barred from ultra-secrets Winston shared only with her. Her world shrank further when her closest friend, Goonie, died of cancer in 1941. Family chaos persisted. Randolph left classified documents in his car and embarrassed Winston at military events. Clementine banned him from their home. On October 10, 1940, Pamela gave birth at Chequers hours after a bomb hit nearby. Randolph was with another man's wife. Clementine calmly signed the baby into the guest book herself. As Chequers became unsafe, they relocated to Ditchley Park. Even its 29 rooms couldn't contain Winston's appetite for comfort. Within 2 weekends, staff requested more rations. Though the nation endured austerity, the Churchills received gifts and exemptions, keeping their table full despite rationing. As war intensified, Clementine, exhausted by constant hosting, delegated diplomatic duties to Pamela, who quickly proved more politically adept than the Churchill daughters. By winter 1940-41, Britain stood alone. Europe was overrun, cities bombed, supplies dwindled, and Japan loomed. Winston's last hope was America. Roosevelt's Arsenal of Democracy speech encouraged but offered no action. He sent his top advisor, Harry Hopkins, to assess if Britain was worth saving. Hopkins, frail and skeptical, believed Britain might be a lost cause. Clementine and Winston knew they had to win him over. Bracken arranged a peaceful train ride to London, while Clementine softened Downing Street with flowers, French art, and a flattering photo of Pamela, knowing Hopkins, a lover of beauty, would notice. Upon arrival, Hopkins accused Winston of hating America, Americans, and Roosevelt. Winston countered with warmth, citing his American roots and FDR admiration. Still unconvinced, Hopkins needed more than charm. The Churchills carefully choreographed his visit. A private lunch won him over. Winston dazzled, Clementine offered comfort. Hopkins, though weak, was uplifted. At Ditchley Park, he was treated to luxury, a warm bed, and witnessed British resilience under fire. The message was clear. Without U.S. aid, Britain would fall. Hopkins left deeply moved. He told Roosevelt, "If courage alone can win, the result will be inevitable." He called Clementine one of the most charming women he'd ever met. At an intimate farewell dinner, Hopkins finally revealed his verdict. Quoting from the Book of Ruth, he assured Churchill and Clementine, "Whither thou goest, I will go. Thy people shall be my people." Tears streamed down Churchill's face, and Clementine wept silently. Hopkins had been won over, and so, in time, would America. Back in Washington, Hopkins became Winston's personal advocate, urging Roosevelt to expand aid. In March 1941, FDR praised Churchill publicly. Hopkins stayed close with Clementine, sending gifts, lipstick, food, even a satin nightgown. Meanwhile, CBS's Edward R. Murrow broadcast from Blitz, London, stirring American hearts. Clementine befriended his wife, Janet, and welcomed them to Downing Street. Murrow's vivid reporting fueled public support, while Hopkins pushed policy. Together, they strengthened Churchill's case. In March 1941, Gil Wynant replaced the isolationist Joe Kennedy as U.S. ambassador. Arriving during an air raid, Wynant declared, "There is no place I'd rather be than in England." He formed a deep bond with Clementine, both idealistic and private. When his son went missing in 1943, she comforted him quietly. Wynant grew closer to the family through a quiet affair with Sarah Churchill. Emotionally fragile after her divorce, Sarah found solace in him. Though unspoken, the relationship was tolerated, for diplomatic reasons. Soon after, Averell Harriman arrived to manage Lend-Lease. Winston staged his arrival for maximum impact, flying him secretly to Chequers. Clementine charmed him, even with something as small as tangerines. Like Hopkins and Wynant, Harriman became a staunch ally. Pamela Churchill, just 21, seized opportunity. After a dinner at the Dorchester, she seduced Harriman, choosing to stay in his bed rather than seek shelter during an air raid. Their affair turned political. She passed intel to Winston, and Lord Beaverbrook even funded her wardrobe to keep her alluring. Captivated, Harriman became a tireless pro-British voice. He convinced FDR to let U.S. ports service British ships, a crucial breakthrough. By Pearl Harbor, he was so aligned with Britain that his neutrality was questioned in Washington. Though married to her son, Clementine approved of Pamela's affair for its strategic value. She welcomed Harriman at checkers. Even Roosevelt and Hopkins joked about the romance, understanding its utility. By 1942, Pamela had moved on from Randolph, now deep in debt and stationed in Cairo. When he found out about the affair, he wasn't upset about betrayal, but furious his parents had allowed it. He accused them of sacrificing him for politics, fracturing their bond permanently. Clementine had become a master of soft diplomacy. She turned checkers dinners into battlegrounds, studying guests in advance and using subtle gestures, like giving Eisenhower extra onions in his stew, to win favor. Winston held court in siren suits. Clementine set the atmosphere in silk robes, directing events from behind the scenes. Still, her contributions went under-acknowledged. While Canadian PM Mackenzie King praised her diplomacy, many others failed to notice her behind Winston's towering shadow. Despite all efforts, Roosevelt hesitated to commit troops. Even attacks on U.S. ships weren't enough. In June 1941, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, forcing Stalin into the war. Soviet Ambassador Ivan Maisky demanded a second front in France. Winston resisted. Britain was overstretched. When Maisky pressed Hopkins, Clementine stepped in, gently diverting the topic to protect their fragile position. By August 1941, Clementine was physically and emotionally spent. The pressure of diplomacy, war work, and family breakdowns had taken their toll. Even Churchill's closest allies, Beaverbrook, Alan Brooke, his bodyguard, were showing signs of collapse. As Winston left for a meeting with Roosevelt, Clementine checked into a controversial nature cure clinic. There she underwent massage therapy, osteopathy, and a strict liquid diet. Though briefly restored, her doctor's prescription to rest once a week proved unrealistic. Neither Hitler nor Winston paused. On December 7, 1941, as Clementine slept, Japan attacked. By the next day, America had declared war on Japan, followed by Germany and Italy. Churchill, exhaling relief, called it the sleep of the saved and the thankful. After years of isolation, Britain was no longer alone. Winston traveled to Washington before Christmas, staying at the White House. His late nights, drinking, and intensity exhausted staff. He refused Roosevelt's weak martinis, opting for water. While FDR enjoyed him, Eleanor Roosevelt was unimpressed, especially after Winston joked that Clementine did nothing. Their cultural differences showed. Eleanor's austere meals clashed with Britain's wartime scarcity. On Christmas Eve, after the tree lighting, Churchill experienced heart palpitations, followed by chest pains after addressing Congress. Lord Moran suspected a mild heart attack, but kept it secret. Meanwhile, British morale sank after the fall of Singapore. To maintain unity, Churchill named Labour leader Clement Attlee Deputy Prime Minister. Clementine, alarmed by Beaverbrook's erratic behavior, warned Winston to exorcise him, referring to him as the bottle imp. In June 1942, Britain's surrender at Tobruk sparked public outrage. Churchill narrowly survived a no-confidence vote. After victory at El Alamein in November, he wanted to ring church bells, but Clementine and Mary urged restraint until Tobruk was avenged. That October, Eleanor Roosevelt toured Britain, bringing a Virginia ham and a request from FDR that the Churchills host her. Though vastly different, Eleanor was blunt, Clementine formal. The two bonded over shared burdens and grief. While Eleanor shaped policy through activism, Clementine influenced Winston behind the scenes. Eleanor embraced rationing, wore modest clothes, and praised British women's wartime efforts, helping elevate their image in American eyes. Treasury Secretary Morgenthau even said England would have collapsed without them. For Clementine, long devoted to women's mobilization, this was a personal win. By January 1943, Lord Moran warned Clementine that Winston's heart was worsening. She kept it to herself to protect his focus. His constant travel, by plane and ship, posed grave risks. Mary later said her mother's serenity masked enormous strain. Despite her private worries, Clementine stepped up publicly. She gave speeches, raised funds, and became the first woman to speak at the London Stock Exchange. Her crowning achievement was leading the Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund, raising £8 million, roughly £300 million today, strengthening ties with the Soviet Union. In May 1943, Winston prepared for another U.S. visit. Clementine urged him to push FDR to prioritize Europe over the Pacific. Eleanor, offended she hadn't been warned of their arrival, vented in her column. Roosevelt was livid. Clementine, by contrast, kept silent, preserving Winston's image. Their marriage, built on honesty, sharply contrasted with FDR's secretive dynamic with Eleanor. But by 1943, Roosevelt no longer viewed Churchill as an equal. As U.S. power grew, FDR resented Winston's global stature and favored Stalin. He even planned a secret meeting with Stalin, excluding Churchill, marking Britain's fading influence in the Grand Alliance. After the North Africa campaign, the Churchills briefly relaxed, attending plays, playing cards, enjoying rare praise. But respite was short-lived. In August, they traveled to Quebec for a summit on Italy and the planned invasion of France. Clementine joined Winston at Quebec, her first major summit, with Mary in tow. The ocean voyage left her drained, and it was clear America now dominated. Once an expert diplomat, Clementine now struggled to keep pace. After Quebec, the family vacationed in the Laurentians, but Clementine, anxious and fatigued, left early. At a stop in Washington, they visited a dying Harry Hopkins. Though once FDR's closest aide, Hopkins had been cast aside. Clementine, however, impressed the U.S. press, hailed as Winston's greatest asset. Yet the frost was clear. Roosevelt didn't say goodbye at Hyde Park and offered only a bland response to Winston's heartfelt anniversary letter. As one aide said, there was a definite chill of autumn. At the Tehran conference, Clementine's fears were realized. Eleanor was again barred from attending, only to learn Sarah Churchill would join instead. Clementine confessed she felt more alone than ever. At Tehran, Roosevelt and Stalin bonded, mocking Churchill and isolating him. As Mary Churchill put it, Roosevelt was out to charm Stalin. My father was the odd man out. Clementine had warned this would happen. The Big Three had become the Big Two. 6 weeks into the trip, Winston collapsed from pneumonia and an irregular heartbeat. Refusing sea travel, he flew to Tunis near unconscious. The cabinet begged Clementine to come. When fog grounded her flight, she drove through the night to RAF Lynham, then boarded a freezing bomber in a bulky flight suit, terrified but determined. During the icy flight, she played backgammon with Jock Colville, while Sarah read Pride and Prejudice to Winston. She arrived on December 17th, and Winston instantly improved. His doctor noted his morale surged. He telegrammed Mary, "Your mother is here." All is joyful. Clementine stayed at his side, managing meals and correcting Eisenhower's staff when they served him poorly. Though Winston's temper returned with his strength, only she could soothe him. She alone made his outbursts bearable. As Winston recovered, tensions with de Gaulle flared again. Clementine intercepted him in the garden, warning, "You must not hate your allies more than your enemies." The remark worked. Lunch passed without incident, and de Gaulle even spoke English. On January 18, 1944, Winston returned to Parliament but received only polite applause. Clementine sensed the political winds shifting. Later, Winston complained of chest pains, dismissed as indigestion, but signaling deeper decline. Churchill feared D-Day might mirror the disaster of Gallipoli, but Stalin's pressure forced the Allies to act. Security was strict. Clementine made sure Eisenhower was fed and rested, while Winston chain-smoked through delays. Unlike Roosevelt, who only told Eleanor the night before, Winston confided every detail to Clementine. Though he wanted to watch from HMS Belfast, both she and King George VI blocked him. On June 6th, Clementine waited anxiously with General Brooke. By nightfall, the landings had succeeded, and Winston addressed Parliament in triumph. Churchill visited Normandy on June 12th, but while the invasion was a success, his influence waned. Roosevelt and Eisenhower now steered the war. Withdrawn, Winston delayed decisions and reminisced about the past. Clementine began excusing herself from his late-night monologues. By late 1944, even Downing Street staff saw the decline. He was slipping physically, mentally, and politically. London soon endured a new siege. V-1 bombs hit on June 13th, crippling morale. Churchill, exhausted and short-tempered, focused solely on Europe and ignored the growing unrest at home. Morgenthau even warned British leaders might be unwelcome in bomb shelters. The solution was Clementine. Still beloved, she toured shelters and hospitals, lifting spirits and offering reassurance. Morgenthau, struck by her resolve, called her unbelievable, like Mrs. Roosevelt. In August 1944, while Clementine attended a service at St. Paul's, Winston returned from Italy with pneumonia and a 103-degree fever. The illness was kept secret. He had a summit with Roosevelt in 6 days and refused to cancel. Clementine, fearing collapse, could only watch him press on. At the Quebec conference, Roosevelt brought Eleanor, prompting Winston to bring Clementine to ease tensions. Eleanor, still frustrated by previous exclusions, demanded Clementine give a radio speech. Nervous and tipsy after a lavish lunch, Clementine delivered it successfully. Behind the scenes, she managed Winston's drinking and wrote Eleanor a diplomatic letter, reminding her of Britain's post-war reliance on American aid. Meanwhile, family tensions flared. Though wounded, Randolph wouldn't let his son visit Chequers while Pamela had scarlet fever. When Winston hid one of Clementine's letters to avoid more conflict, she was furious. Later, inviting Pamela for Christmas angered Mary. Winston ultimately rescinded the invitation. Winston grew more autocratic, even considering making himself foreign secretary. Clementine stepped in. As he grew darker, she increased her public presence. In March 1945, she toured YWCA clubs in Brussels and impressed even the Soviets. Stalin invited her to Moscow in recognition of her Red Cross work. She accepted, studying Russian and modifying her uniform to appear more dignified. Before the trip, she was honored at Buckingham Palace and hosted a farewell party, inviting even Beaverbrook. She confided to Sarah that she felt like a nervous old lady. On April 1st, Winston gave her a diamond brooch for her upcoming 60th birthday. On April 7th, Clementine met Stalin alone and presented a gold pen from Winston, suggesting it be used for friendly correspondence. Stalin dismissed it, saying he only used pencils, a pointed comment on Britain's declining influence. Though Stalin was cold, Russian soldiers gave her a heartfelt send-off. She even challenged Ambassador Maysky over Soviet deportations of Poles, forcing him into uncomfortable denials. Privately, she wrote that Britain should cut ties if Soviet behavior didn't change, bolder than Winston dared. Her visit wasn't just symbolic. She met with leaders like Tito, embraced Russian culture, and even sang in Russian at events. On April 13th, she learned of Roosevelt's death and sent Eleanor a formal note. Winston's emotional message moved Eleanor deeply. Clementine mourned Roosevelt's passing, so close to peace, yet just out of reach. As the war ended, Clementine arranged a British victory service in Moscow, including the Red Dean of Canterbury to appease the Soviets. On May 8th, she toasted victory, writing to Winston, "It could not have happened without you." But both sensed the Cold War had already begun. Before leaving, Clementine received the Order of the Red Banner of Labor, but Stalin refused to meet again, sending a deputy instead. On May 12th, her plane circled until Winston's arrival, creating a dramatic and symbolic reunion. While Winston basked in his wartime glory, Clementine foresaw danger. She warned against his Gestapo state jab at labor, but Beaverbrook encouraged it. The backlash was instant. Even The Economist condemned the remark. Voters, disillusioned by post-World War I failures, now wanted change. Despite campaigning tirelessly, sometimes delivering 6 speeches in a single night, Clementine knew Labor's message was resonating. When Winston declared, "The women are for me," she reminded him of his past opposition to women's suffrage. Clementine stayed home as Winston went to Potsdam, certain of defeat. On July 26, 1945, Labor won in a landslide. Even safe conservative seats fell. Churchill resigned, offering cigars and a forced toast. The hero who led England out of its darkest hour had been voted out. Clementine called it a blessing in disguise. Winston didn't agree. They hosted a dignified farewell dinner and packed up number 10. Clementine personally welcomed Violet Attlee, graceful even in defeat. World leaders were stunned by Churchill's defeat. At Potsdam, Molotov simply asked, "Why?" Eleanor Roosevelt understood their grief. Winston told his doctor, "It would have been better to have died like Roosevelt." Clementine had hoped he'd retire at his peak. Instead, she quietly arranged their move to 28 Hyde Park Gate. Public backlash over renovations stung. Chartwell, crumbling, was saved only through public donations. Post-war rationing wore on Winston, who grew irritable. A £50,000 fund, organized by Lord Camrose, preserved Chartwell under the National Trust. Clementine hosted a moving thank you luncheon. Even the chauffeurs were invited. With Chartwell secure, Winston embraced country life, buying 500 acres of farmland. Though still leader of the opposition, he barely attended Parliament. As war faded, Clementine felt purposeless. She was no longer a key diplomatic partner, but a caretaker to Winston's routines. Their marriage grew tense. At a dinner party, he publicly humiliated her. Mary comforted her mother, who quietly longed for a gentler life, free from Winston's relentless orbit. In 1946, Attlee made her a dame. Honorary degrees followed, but the tribute that mattered most came in 1948. A rare letter from Winston on their 40th anniversary, thanking her for her support. She resumed managing his image and drinking behind the scenes. Unlike Eleanor Roosevelt, who shaped post-war human rights policy, Clementine struggled to define her role. She remained cordial, exchanging greetings with Eleanor, even as Winston mocked her initiatives. Clementine turned to causes she believed in: the YWCA, refugee support, and women's education. She helped found Newhall at Cambridge and championed coeducation at Churchill College, planting seeds that would later bloom. Lacking a public role, Clementine embraced her family. When Mary married Christopher Soames in 1947, Clementine welcomed them close by. She treasured nursery teas and picnics with her grandchildren, experiences she had missed with her own children. Family tensions persisted. Clementine never warmed to Diana's husband, Duncan Sandys, and remained furious at Randolph's behavior. Their feud over Pamela's wartime affairs deepened. Randolph felt betrayed, but Clementine stood by Pamela. Though Pamela's affairs attracted gossip, Clementine defended her, especially after Ed Murrow ended things. Randolph's drinking and temper spiraled. Clementine bailed him out repeatedly, even buying him a house when he remarried in 1948. The marriage soon failed. Meanwhile, Sarah chased an acting career in Hollywood, but after Gil Wynant's suicide in 1947, she was emotionally shattered. Sarah's impulsive romance with photographer Antony Beauchamp alarmed both parents. Clementine overheard their fights, and despite protests, Sarah eloped in Georgia and broke the news via the press. Hurt, Clementine briefly ignored her, prompting a furious letter. She later apologized and even bought them a home, though she never trusted the marriage or Sarah's increasing drinking. To escape, the Churchills resumed travel. At Beaverbrook's villa, Winston suffered a mild stroke. Clementine stayed behind to prevent suspicion. It signaled his declining health. Around the same time, she underwent major surgery abroad. When a 1951 snap election returned Winston to power at age 76, Clementine feared it would kill him. Winston was thrilled, but Clementine distrusted his all-conservative cabinet. Though sidelined politically, she intervened, successfully blocking Duncan Sandys as war secretary. In 1952, she made a final public appearance, touring flood-damaged East Anglia before retreating to Capri with Sarah to recover. Back at number 10, Clementine transformed the Prime Minister's residence with personal elegance. Following King George VI's death, she meticulously prepared their role in the Queen's coronation. Despite painful neuritis, she masked her suffering and fulfilled her duties. After the coronation, Winston collapsed at dinner. Guests assumed he was drunk, but he'd had a serious stroke. Nevertheless, he refused to step down. Clementine acted quickly, stopping him from speaking in Parliament and having him relocated to Chartwell. Too weak for the Bermuda summit, he leaned heavily on her, even as she nursed broken ribs from a fall. In October 1953, he resumed full duties and received the Nobel Prize in Literature. Unable to travel, he sent Clementine to Stockholm in his place. She was moved when the orchestra played "Oh My Darling Clementine." As Winston's temper worsened, Clementine became more assertive, once rapping his knuckles with a fork. Though they clashed, they always reconciled. Her neuritis worsened, and in 1954, she sought treatment at Aix-les-Bains. She returned slightly improved, but fragile. The 1950s brought emotional crises. Diana had a breakdown during Winston's stroke and once threatened Clementine with a knife. Winston, too frail, could not help, leaving Clementine to manage alone. Sarah spiraled after Beauchamp's 1957 suicide. She was arrested in Malibu, institutionalized across Europe, and later jailed in Holloway. Clementine shielded her from scandal, managed legal issues, and pushed her toward recovery. In 1955, Clementine's beloved sister Nellie died. She had nursed her through illness. Nellie's final public appearance had been Winston's 80th birthday, where Graham Sutherland's brooding portrait was unveiled. Once supportive of it, Clementine came to loathe the image. With Grace Hamblin's help, she secretly had it burned in the Chartwell garden, never confessing to it. As doubts over Winston's capacity grew, Harold Macmillan asked Clementine to intervene. She invited Jock Colville to lunch, then gently urged Winston to step down. He refused. Clementine blamed Macmillan for forcing the issue. By early 1955, Winston finally relented. Clementine, exhausted and unwell, stayed at Chequers while he sulked in Downing Street. On April 1st, 1955, the Churchills hosted a farewell party coinciding with Clementine's 70th birthday. Despite being in pain, she pushed through with medication. 4 days later, Winston resigned to staff applause. Clementine stayed behind to manage their departure before joining him at Chartwell for Easter. A planned Sicilian getaway was cut short by her declining health. Winston turned to painting and writing, but Clementine, having long lived in his shadow, felt purposeless. She found companionship in her young secretary Heather Wood, even taking her to St. Moritz. One morning, she said softly, "I do hope you are not being worn out by this tiresome old woman." By the late 1950s, Winston ignored Clementine's fragile condition. She bonded instead with widowed diplomat Louis Einstein during a trip to St. Moritz. Dependent on opiates for neuritis, she endured insomnia and mood swings. After a hospital stay in 1956, she declined Winston's invitation to La Pausa and took an 8-week solo cruise to Ceylon, only to learn Heather had moved on, deepening her loneliness. Clementine despised Emery Reeves and his partner Wendy Russell, who she believed infantilized Winston. He doted on Wendy, embarrassing Clementine. She refused to return to La Pausa unless they distanced themselves, relaxing only when Aristotle and Tina Onassis joined. Yet even amid wealth, Clementine felt adrift, no longer a wartime rock, but a woman struggling for relevance. In 1958, the Churchills celebrated 50 years of marriage on Onassis's yacht, where Clementine finally stole the spotlight. Their travels lasted until 1962, ending after Onassis left Tina for Maria Callas. Out of loyalty to Tina, Clementine refused future invites, though Winston continued. On one cruise, Randolph shocked guests by accusing his parents of encouraging Pamela's wartime affairs. Around the same time, Diana's marriage collapsed, and Duncan Sandys was caught in the Duchess of Argyll scandal. The ordeal drew Clementine and Diana closer. Sarah briefly found happiness marrying Baron Henry Audley in 1962, but he died within 15 months. At Chartwell, Winston quietly told her, "We must close ranks and march on." By 1958, Winston was battling pneumonia, deafness, and depression. Clementine, too, was often ill, hospitalized in 1961 for shingles. While she recovered, Winston kept cruising with Onassis. His political power waned. His 1959 re-election came with a smaller majority, and a 1962 fall in Monte Carlo resulted in 2 surgeries. Clementine stayed beside him as he smoked in bed, ignored doctors, and even set fires. By 1963, he admitted his career was over. Clementine rejected an early draft of his farewell tribute. The revised version was quietly presented by Prime Minister Douglas Home. Afterwards, they sat in silence, relics of a vanishing age. In October 1963, Clementine suffered a severe depressive episode and underwent electroconvulsive therapy. Still recovering, she was blindsided when Diana died of an overdose, just hours after making plans with her. Mary broke the news gently to Winston, who wept in silence for a day. Clementine, too weak to attend the funeral, joined him at the memorial. For Winston's 90th birthday in November 1964, Clementine arranged a candlelit gathering. He was detached, already slipping away. On January 12, 1965, he suffered another stroke and fell into a coma. Clementine held his hand as a priest prayed. Winston Churchill passed away on January 24, 1965, at the age of 90, surrounded by his family and by the woman who had devoted her entire life to him. His body lay in state at Westminster Hall, where Clementine visited each night in private. Queen Elizabeth's attendance at his funeral on January 30th was a rare honor. As cranes bowed on the Thames and his coffin passed, Clementine laid a final wreath at Blenheim and whispered, "I will soon be with you again." Clementine never returned to Chartwell. She donated it to the National Trust and moved to 7 Prince's Gate. Financial worries led her to auction 5 of Winston's paintings for £86,300, sparking public outrage. Pensioners sent her donations, which she gently returned. Diana's death softened her view of Randolph, who showed rare kindness in her later years. In 1965, she was made Baroness Spencer Churchill, but illness limited her public life. Tragedy lingered. Randolph died of a heart attack in 1968. Sarah, undone by grief and addiction, died of alcoholism in 1974. Only Mary thrived, living until 2014. Clementine fiercely protected Winston's legacy, once scolding granddaughter Arabella's behavior, and never doubted history would vindicate him. Though physically frail, Clementine's mind remained sharp. She enjoyed luncheons and visits from friends like Violet Bonham Carter and her former daughter-in-law Pamela. When Pamela married Averell Harriman, Clementine dryly quipped, "An old flame rekindled." But Winston's absence was an open wound. "What I miss most," she admitted, "is his company, his affectionate nature, his wit, and his longing to kindle passions." Clementine died of a heart attack on December 12, 1977, at 92, and was buried beside Winston at Blaydon, just as she had wished. A memorial was held in Westminster Abbey on January 24, 1978, 13 years to the day after his death. Her grandson read the same words spoken at her wedding. There must be in the statesman's life many times when he depends upon the love, the insight, the penetrating sympathy and devotion of his wife. Clementine had been all that and more. Clementine was never supposed to shape history, but she did. From an anxious and fearful young girl emerged the steel behind Britain's wartime leader. Her painful childhood bred the resilience she'd need to endure war, Winston's temper, and life in the public eye. She was imperfect, often anxious, moody, and distant as a mother. But she was also Winston's strategist, moral compass, and protector. If Winston was fire, Clementine was the hand that kept him from burning everything down. Clement Attlee famously said Churchill was 50% genius, 50% bloody fool, and she spent her life managing both halves. Together, they formed one of history's most significant political partnerships. So when Winston declared he had nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat, he left out one crucial thing. He also had his darling Clementine. So, what did you think of the remarkable life of Clementine Churchill? Had you ever heard just how vital she was, not only to Winston, but to history itself? What struck you most about the bond between Clementine and Winston, their shared fire, their battles, their deep loyalty? Do you think the famous phrase, "behind every great man is an even greater woman," truly fits her? Or perhaps she wasn't behind him at all, but right there beside him every step of the way? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So drop a comment below and let's keep the conversation going. And don't forget to use my link for 2 weeks free of Aura. Stop leaving yourself vulnerable to data brokers and scammers. Protect yourself today. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, keep seeking the stories that move your soul.